Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Roosevelt Institute, thank you for joining us today. Our program will begin in just a moment.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Felicia Wong, and I'm president of the Roosevelt Institute, and I could not be more delighted than to be here this afternoon with my friends and colleagues, Sandy Darity and Dorian Warren. I'll introduce them properly in a moment, but I wanted to just say a little bit about why we're here today and how we're going to structure the next 55 minutes. So the title of our webinar today is The Hidden Rules of Race and the Quest for Reparations. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. The first thing is really to celebrate a book that Dorian and I co-wrote with Andrea Flynn, who I know is also on this call today, and Susan Holmberg. And that book was really encouraged and edited by Sandy, and that's called The Hidden Rules of Race. So that's the first thing. The second thing we'll do is to dive specifically into the rules of racial wealth, which we emphasize in this book. It's not the only thing we talk about in the book, but it's what we're going to be talking about here today. You know, really, why is wealth different than income? Why is it differently important? And why do we have to focus on wealth if we're going to get to genuine economic, political, and racial equality? And then third, what we'll be talking about, and I think the reason many of you are on this call, on this webinar, we're really going to get into it on a policy idea that, I don't know, maybe Sandy, that this is an idea whose time has come, the idea of reparations for Black Americans. So those are the three things that the three of us are going to talk about. I'll be mostly moderating for the first maybe 40 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you'd like, if you have a question, please ask it in your chat function, and I will read them. Some colleagues will help curate them for me, and we'll go ahead and ask the panelists and get some, I'm sure, some great answers. So let me just say a little bit about the Racial Rules book, because it is one of the things that brought me and Dorian and Sandy together on a particular project. You know, the Racial Rules book, Hidden Rules of Race, really started with a lunch that Dorian and I had in 2014. We were talking over sushi, as I recall, or maybe some kind of Japanese noodles. I can't remember, but we were talking about how great it would be to really have an academic complement to Ta-Nehisi Coates' amazing and transformative essay, which had just come out and which really focused on the stories of a set of people who did not have any wealth, in large part because of the various kinds of housing, essentially scams that they had been subject to, and the kind of housing market that they were in as compared to the kind of housing market that white Americans were in. So that essay, which I'm sure all of you know, A Case for Reparations, that was really something that we thought it would be really terrific to have some kind of data focused and broader survey of all of the rules of race, which, as we said in the book, were ultimately kind of hidden from view, but all of the rules of race that ended up kind of putting people into the economic and social and political positions that they're in. We thought it would actually be good to have a kind of primer. These rules are basic and they are widespread and they are everywhere. And we wanted to just show all of the ways in which racial rules structured our lives. You know, a lot of economists talk about the ways that rules structure markets, like antitrust laws determine who gets to do business with whom. Bankruptcy laws determine whose debts can be wiped away and whose can't be wiped away. But we also wanted to point out that it's rules that determine economic and political outcomes, and those are often constituted explicitly or implicitly by race. Who gets to participate in the labor market? At what wages, right? Yes, this was obviously an issue during times of American enslavement in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, but it's also, that remains true today, so we wanted to talk about that. Rules tell us a lot about who gets to accumulate wealth and capital and who doesn't, on what terms, who gets a high quality education and who doesn't, who goes to prison, who doesn't, who gets to vote and have political voice and who doesn't. And these rules are obviously racialized, both in who makes the rules and in who benefits from certain rules and who does not benefit from certain rules. And we thought it was interesting and important because the racial rules lens really gets at things that other explanations, mostly neoclassical economic explanations, which still undergird much of our policymaking, neoclassical explanations just miss a lot of things, we thought. Neoclassical economics assumes that all individuals are equal and bargaining in a system that is fair, or if it's not fair, a few little tweaks are going to make sure that ultimately it is fair. And so in that imagined system of neoclassical economics, aggregating interests is going to get you to optimal outcomes. Neoclassical economics also assumes that equilibrium and not change is the goal. But for those of us who care a lot about racialized inequalities, change is precisely the goal. So that's what we're here to talk about today, changing the rules that have been exclusionary for centuries. So without further ado, I'm going to start asking a bunch of questions to Dorian and Sandy. Let me just introduce them properly as I'd promised at the top of the hour. Sandy Darity, William Darity, Sandy, is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, and Economics at Duke University and runs the Cook Center there. And Dorian Warren is the president of Community Change. He is a longtime author, labor organizer, and activist, and serves on the boards of Working Partnerships USA, the National Employment Law Project, and The Nation magazine. And both Dorian and Sandy are and or recently have been fellows at the Roosevelt Institute. So it's great to have you guys both with us today to talk about questions of race, wealth, and reparations. I'm going to start with a set of questions for Dorian and then turn it to Sandy. But Dorian, you and I have talked for years about wealth, how wealth is different from income, why wealth matters. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about how you've been thinking about that lately, specifically in this time of COVID-19.
Yes, thank you, Felicia, very much for hosting us. Thank you to the Roosevelt Institute team. Clearly, that was an old picture because I now have COVID-19 here in the midst of this pandemic. But to answer your question, Felicia, we talked a lot about how the racial rules that shape the life chances and fates of Black people in this country are across many, many issue areas and domains. And they're all connected: income, wealth, education, criminal justice, health, democratic participation. They're real in any given person's life, and they're all integrated and interwoven. Well, let's just take a minute to take wealth out for a second and really explain what we mean. So with apologies to the cancellation soon of Major League Baseball, I want to use a baseball metaphor. And Barry Switzer, former player, famously said, there are some people that go through life who are born on third base, but they think that they hit a triple. Others can't even get to first base, particularly Black people. Others can't even get into the game to play, and race structures all of that. So the rules of the game determine one's life chances and wealth. And the rules in this case, as we, with our co-authors, Andrea and Sue, wrote about in the book, the rules are the rules of the racial caste system, to borrow from Isabel Wilkerson's new book. Now, there is something called the racial wage gap. That's distinct from the racial wealth divide or the racial wealth gap. What is wealth? Wealth is, it takes many forms. It's kind of an insurance. It's about risk and investment, and it allows one to transfer resources to future generations. So if you have wealth, it allows you to fall back on tough times and be resilient, like many people, more privileged people in our country right now are doing in the midst of mass unemployment and a global pandemic. Wealth also allows you to take risk. It allows you to invest, whether in education, in businesses, in homes, in your children. And as I mentioned, the social science term is intergenerational transmission of wealth, but it really is about passing on wealth to your kids that allows mobility in our system. Now, the wealth gap, the racial wealth divide, we can say has been structured by racial rules, by policies that have been both race explicit, but also racially disparate in terms of impact. And the racial wealth gap constrains it has over time constrained the asset building of Black people and non-whites in this country. The racial rules have also enabled asset building for whites at the same time. So let me just take a couple more minutes to walk through a little bit of history, which, by the way, you have to read Sandy's new book because the book goes into great detail. Like the first third is all about this history. And the way I think about our long history in this country, since we've been talking about for the last year, the 1619 Project, if you think of our entire history from 1619 with three numbers, 25, 10, and 5. And 25, 10, and 5 really just refer to decades. So the first 25 decades, we had a system of racialized slavery and bondage. The next 10 decades or 100 years was roughly Jim Crow, particularly in the South. And then it's really only been 5 decades since the Civil Rights Revolution that helped to change some of the racial rules. What's important about that first number, 25, or the first 250 years of the rules around slavery and bondage is that, of course, we know slaves were property. Whites were able to accumulate wealth in relation to the racial rules of unfreedom for Black people. Black bodies were also a source of national wealth for this country in terms of agriculture, particularly in the South, but also who financed all of that agriculture in the South, right? So if you think of New York City and Wall Street. I want to read a quote actually from Isabel Wilkerson's recent book that just came out, I believe this week, called Caste, where she argues that the institution of slavery was for a quarter millennium, the conversion of human beings into currency, into machines who existed solely for the profit of their owners, which got turned into white wealth, to be worked as long as the owners desired, who had no rights over their bodies or loved ones, who could be mortgaged, bred, won in a bet, given as wedding presents, bequeathed to heirs, sold away from spouses, or children to cover an owner's debt, or to spite a rival or to settle an estate. That is the first quarter millennium of this country. We had a civil war, just to collapse history really shortly, and then we had another 100 years after the end of Reconstruction, which again, Sandy details in great detail in his book. We had another 100 years of Jim Crow rules in the South. And there were racial rules there, vagrancy laws or debt peonage and contract labor laws, which prevented the wealth accumulation for Black folks. During that 100-year span, say from roughly the 1870s through the 1950s, we did have this thing called the New Deal. And here we are as the Roosevelt Institute, and we're very proud of the New Deal, but we also know that the New Deal had rules, racial rules that excluded Blacks and helped to build the white middle class. The New Deal rules helped to create residential racial segregation. The New Deal rules were not just racialized, they were gendered. So I'm thinking in particular about the plight of Black women here, and I'm gonna come back to that. There were a whole lot of home ownership rules, Homeowners Loan Corporation that permitted redlining, the Federal Housing Administration in terms of the facilitation of suburban development, of property ownership for whites. There's something called the GI Bill, of which blacks are excluded. All of these rules around race were around wealth building or lack thereof. Let me fast forward, frankly, and I'll start to close here. What were the causes of these rules, of these racial rules of wealth? The punchline here is power. Policy choices that were the result of political actors in our political system depended on the disempowerment of Black Americans. It depended on the exclusion of Black voters and what we might think of as an authoritarian, one-party Jim Crow South. We're having a whole conversation these days about authoritarianism. Let's remember authoritarianism was homegrown in this country, and it was called the Jim Crow South of the old Confederacy. And those rules of exclusion from the democracy of the exclusion of Black people from the democracy, who, if they had the right to vote, if we had the right to vote, we could have changed the rules, right? So the rules and power undergirded the racial rules around wealth and contributed directly to the racial wealth divide that we experience today. Last but not least, let me just say the consequences of the lack of wealth for Black people, all the way from the first 250 years, then the next 100 years of Jim Crow, and even in the last 50 years, it has weakened the ability of Black Americans to absorb crises, like the crises in which we find ourselves living now. It has decreased and denied access to opportunity, and especially the case if you're a Black woman, and especially the case if you're a single Black woman with kids, you have the least amount of wealth relative to Black men, to white women, and to white men. So it's important to think about, I just want to end on this note, to think about Black women in particular in this conversation as the miner's canary of our democracy and our economy. The miner's canary, miners would take canaries in the coal mines because they had smaller lungs. And so they would alert mine workers to the dangers of toxic gases. That is essentially the metaphor for wealth, race, the racial rules. And when you look at Black women as the miner's canary of our country, we see all the structural problems, we might say, in our racial caste system. So with that, I want to give it back to you, Felicia, so we can hear from Sandy, because he's not only going to discuss wealth, he's going to discuss what to do about it.
Great, thanks, Dorian. You know, I'm so glad you went into history so assiduously, because the way I think about wealth is crystallized history. What you have and what you don't have is a reflection of what your parents and your grandparents had and didn't have. And that is a reflection of rules that cast very, very, very long shadows. So yeah, wealth is crystallized history. But it's also a set of choices. We can make choices to make different rules that actually can reverse some of that history. And with that, I'd really like to turn it to Sandy to tell us about his new book and his new research. And Sandy, I'm going to start with a very specific question for you. There are many, many kinds of racialized injustices and inequalities that you could focus on. But you laser focus on wealth, and you actually go right to the importance of 40 acres, right? You really talk about a point in time whereby you believe this kind of racialized wealth disparity could have been significantly lessened or even obliterated, but it was not. So tell us about your new book and why you focus specifically on the 40 acres.
So our new book is called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And I've had the pleasure of authoring the book with my life partner, Kirsten Mullen. The book is focused on developing a case for reparations that's inclusive of 3 phases of American history. The first phase is the 25 decades that Dorian referred to, although we actually focus on the period from 1776 to the present rather than 1619. Because we identify the United States government as the culpable party for the relevant case for reparations that we try to make in the book. And so the United States government didn't exist in 1619, so we focus on the period from the formation of the Republic. But that first phase is the period of slavery. The second phase is nearly 100 years of legal segregation, or what we customarily refer to as the Jim Crow period. And then the final phase is the most recent years that we have experienced, decades that we have experienced since the Civil Rights Revolution. And that period is characterized by ongoing atrocities, inclusive of mass incarceration, ongoing police executions of unarmed blacks, the presence of discrimination in employment, credit, and housing markets, despite the passage of anti-discrimination legislation, inclusive of affirmative action. And indeed, it's very significant, I think, that Ira Katznelson wrote a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And I'd like to talk about affirmative action for white people, which is critical to understanding the scope and magnitude of the current racial wealth disparity. And that disparity is captured well by the fact that Black Americans constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. That corresponds to a situation where the average Black household has $800,000 less in net worth than the average white household. So these are enormous disparities, and if we were to close them, it would require an expenditure in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion. And I will argue that that is the minimum bottom line for a reparations project that would be targeted at eliminating the racial wealth differential. But with respect to affirmative action for white people that shaped or crafted the racial wealth gap, of course we need to start with slavery. But the second period of relevant national policies that provided benefits for whites that were denied blacks are associated with the Homestead Acts, the first of which was passed in 1862. And the Homestead Act's provisions were applied for close to 80 years in the United States. When Black Americans were first emancipated from slavery, they were promised 40 acres land grants throughout the South. That 40 acres promise was never fulfilled. Initially, about 400,000 acres of land were allocated to about 40,000 Black Americans out of the 4 million who were newly emancipated. And there should have been a total allocation of at least 40 million acres. But President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered, reversed the policy and turned it back into a situation where the properties were restored to the former slaveholders, thus creating the original sources of the kinds of wealth differentials that we observe today. And that source was reinforced by the next phase of white affirmative action, which are the Homestead Acts, which provided 160 acres land grants in the western part of the United States that were taken from the Native American population with the objective of settling the West. This meant in turn that approximately 1.5 million white families received land grants at the same time that the newly emancipated Black population was denied any form of restitution for their years of slavery. And I think that Trina Shanks Williams has estimated that anywhere between 45 and 90 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of these land grants to their ancestors. And then the third phase of white affirmative action, particularly in the 19th century, was the wave of white massacres that permitted whites to seize Black property across the country. There were upwards of 100 of these white massacres that took place. In 1919, the Red Summer of 1919, there were upwards of 35 of these massacres that took place in a single year. So this seizure of Black property took place with impunity and with the de facto sanction of the federal government. So when Katznelson looks at affirmative action for whites, he's focused on home ownership in the 20th century, just as Ta-Nehisi Coates is focused on home ownership in the 20th century in his important essay. And they talk about predatory lending, they talk about restrictive covenants, they talk about redlining, and Katznelson in particular talks about the discriminatory application of the GI Bill. And so once again, we've identified a set of policies that produce racial wealth disparities via benefits that were specific and special to white Americans.
Thanks, Sandy. You know, one of the things you talk about, I'd actually like to take you now to this question of where the reparations movement really stands now. And I'm going to start by reminding the audience or letting the audience know that you really make the point that the reparations and the reparations movement is about three things: acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And you say in particular that reparations need to be federal, not just state or local or, you know, Georgetown University recognizing
or guilty individuals. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's many institutions that have tried to do a kind of reparation based on their own particular past, things that they believe they had done wrong in their past. And you would probably agree, Sandy, that those things are wrong, but you say those things are not.
No, absolutely, great. They were wrong, but yeah, but they were not illegal. And that's the problem, and that's why the federal government is the culpable party. The federal government sanctioned these either directly in law or by turning away and ignoring the atrocities that had actually taken place. And so when people bring court cases against, say, corporations and the like for their complicity with slavery or the slave trade, one of the difficulties that they're faced with in bringing those court cases is what these corporations did was certainly evil, but it was not against the law. And so we have to address the institution or entity that produced the laws or the rules that were associated with the practice of these kinds of atrocities. So as a matter of principle, the federal government has the obligation for meeting this debt. But I would also add that the federal government is far more capable of meeting the debt than other institutions across the nation. So for example, if we take the collective budgets of state and local governments, they amount to approximately $3.1 trillion that are used for all purposes that state and local governments engage in. But the bill for reparations, at minimum, if it is designed to eliminate racial wealth differences, is at least $10 to $12 trillion. So even if it was not just a matter of principle, it's really only the federal government that has the capacity to truly meet the bill.
Right. Thank you. And now I actually have a question for both of you about the politics of reparations in this moment. And again, I want to remind people that, Sandy, your framework is acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And you say in particular, atonement is difficult to achieve. You and I have actually talked about the idea that, you know, there's a wound to heal, and atonement, you know, reparations would be a part, you know, a kind of atonement. And you've said, no, atonement is difficult to achieve, but you can measure redress. You can actually measure the racialized wealth or racial wealth disparities shrinking. So for both of you, this is kind of a political question. You know, and I'll start with Sandy, and then Dorian, I'd love to hear your response. The politics of a reparations movement that gets to actual redress, and will that actually get to closure? How could we do this so it got to a kind of closure, and not just a feel good, but a closure that is both economic and political? So Sandy, and then Dorian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that closure can be reached. One of the reasons we identify the racial wealth gulf as a target for a reparations project is precisely because it provides us with a metric that we can use to determine how close or how far away we are from achieving the goal of the reparations project. And if that goal is achieved, We propose in From Here to Equality that it should be achieved within the course of a decade. But if that goal is achieved, then it becomes possible for both the culpable party, the United States government, and the community that was victimized for so many years to come to an agreement that the debt has been paid.
Thank you.
Ooh, that is a hard question, Felicia. And I would just say,
That's why I asked you, Dorian. Politics, political science, movements.
well, yeah, so let's go there, because I do think this is the role of social movements in our history and in terms of transformational change in this country. So everything from abolition to ending child labor, to the right of workers to organize, to women's suffrage, to the civil rights movement and Black freedom movement, of course, of the 60s, to marriage equality, to immigrant rights. All of these were ideas around freedom and emancipation and equality and equity that were at the margins for a long time. And then at some point, they moved to the center. And so it takes that movement energy, it takes that movement organizing and protest and mobilization and electoral power and the power of forceful, bold ideas that Sandy and Kirsten have put forth in their book. It takes all of that to move something from the margins to the center. I'm struck because I wrote a piece a couple of years ago around guaranteed income and reparations. And when I wrote it, I thought, let me take the two least popular ideas in American politics right now, and I'm gonna put them together. And here we are 4 or 5 years later, and we're having a radically different conversation. And the reason why we're having a radically different conversation is because there's movement energy in the air and on the streets. It has quickly done the agenda setting in a different way. It took the hard labor, frankly, of Sandy to do the research over decades in terms of having the full history and the full idea around a program. That has to be now combined with movement energy to really move the idea where it's not, I don't think it's any longer, frankly, in the margins, to keep pushing it to the center of our political debate and discourse.
Yeah, if you went back to the year 2000, there was a survey that was done by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popov, in which they found that 4% of white Americans were in favor of reparations. About a year and a half ago, a comparable survey was conducted, and the percentage was about 15%. But in the aftermath of the onset of the COVID-19 crisis and the tragic death of George Floyd, which I think really has catapulted worldwide attention to the long-standing anti-Black police violence that has been executed in the United States and in other countries like Brazil, for example, that people are now even more receptive to actually taking seriously reparations as a project. And the most recent study I've seen says that 39% of white Americans are now in favor of Black reparations. I think that's a stunning statistic. If it's credible and if it's sustainable, we are in a very different environment from any environment that I've experienced in the course of my lifetime.
Great, Sandy. I'm going to actually ask both my own question and combine it with some of the questions that are coming through in the chat. And it's still on the topic of the politics of reparations. A question has come in that's policymaking often takes place through various institutions, think tanks, lobbyist groups, grassroots organizations, etc. So what's the work that needs to be done in these institutions to advance policy on this front, presumably the reparations front and racial wealth more generally? But what's the work that needs to be done in these institutions to advance policy in DC? And I'll combine it with a question about HR 40, which is has been a proposal that John Conyers has put forward, I believe, every year since 1979. Is that right? In the House. So why don't you talk, Sandy?
1989.
Sorry, was it 89? Okay.
It's a long time also, but yeah.
Yeah, what's a decade when you're really talking about centuries worth of injustice? But at any rate, talk a little bit about HR 40 in particular, and also both of you, I'd be interested in the kinds of policy making that needs to happen and the pressure that needs to be brought to bear from these kinds of organizations to advance racial wealth policy, racial wealth disparity shrinking policy in DC in particular. But Sandy, I'm going to go to you first.
Well, Carson and I have argued for a while that institutions that feel some sense of complicity or have had their complicity exposed, or they acknowledge it with respect to the various atrocities that span the trajectory of how white supremacy has proceeded in the United States, should form a coalition and petition and lobby Congress for a full-scale, comprehensive program of reparations for Black Americans. So that's what I see as a primary political action that can be taken by the organizations that you're describing. And I think that many of these organizations have now focused on expressing their support for H.R. 40, which is this piece of legislation that was first introduced by the late Congressman John Conyers, which was intended to establish a study commission for reparations and for the development of proposals for reparations for African Americans. I think that that's appropriate because, as a prelude to the reparations that were paid to Japanese Americans for their incarceration in World War II, there was a study commission. It was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians that accomplished two objectives. The first was it established that Japanese Americans were forced into these various internment camps across the country, despite the fact that American officials knew that they were not a national security threat. And that secondly, the report that was generated by that commission provided a legislative roadmap for the provision of restitution for the Japanese Americans who had been unjustly incarcerated. I think that we need something comparable for Black Americans, but unfortunately, and this is probably going to be a more extended response than you had anticipated, but unfortunately, H.R. 40 does not provide the appropriate text that would generate the kind of commission report that would produce an appropriate program of restitution for Black Americans. First of all, in 2015-2016, if you examine the text of H.R. 40, it provided for 7 members of the commission. But if you look at the 2016-2017 version, it provides for 13 members. Now, the original 7 were supposed to be appointed by the president, 3 by the president, 3 by the Speaker of the House, and 1 by the President pro tempore of the Senate. You know, I've always felt that if you had a congressional commission, then all of the members should be appointed by the Congress itself. But nevertheless, those were the original provisions. But when you go to the 2016-2017 version, you find that there's a specification for 13 members, including 6 who would be representatives of the primary advocacy groups for reparations historically. And I tried to figure out why that provision had been changed, but there's an obvious reason. The organization NCOBRA and its allies, the National Coalition on Black Reparations in America, and its allies actually rewrote the legislation between those 2 years to incorporate positions essentially for themselves. And it's interesting to note that during the same interval, the budget for the commission was increased from $8 million to $12 million. This is in the context of a proposal that assigns GS-18 level salaries to the commissioners, which is essentially in the vicinity of $200,000. And now we begin to have the appearance of impropriety, given the fact that these organizations wrote themselves into the legislation. A final point I'd like to make about this is that the vision for reparations that NCOBRA and its allies have is a flawed vision on three grounds. First of all, their vision of who should be eligible for reparations is a mistaken vision. Eligibility for reparations should be designated for Black American descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. That would provide the direct connection to the individuals who were denied the 40-acre land grants in the aftermath of the Civil War. Second, INCOBRA and its allies do not have a commitment to elimination of the racial wealth disparity that we've talked about so much. And third, INCOBRA and its allies are not committed to the provision of direct payments to eligible recipients, although virtually all major reparations efforts have involved direct payments to the victim community, ranging from the German provision of payments to the victims of the Holocaust to the Japanese American victims of unjust incarceration receiving payments from the United States government. So I think that it's important that there's maximum discretion over the usage of the funds from eligible recipients. The commission has a sacred mission and it should not be sabotaged by self-interest.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. I think that is an important and detailed explication of one particular part of the sort of DC-based, politically based reparations movement. Dorian, as our only DC resident actually on this panel,
I have all the feelings about this.
What else are you seeing? And as somebody who spends a lot of time with a lot of other movement leaders, Black movement leaders, so what are you seeing in terms of the push for reparations and other things that are designed, other policies that are designed to reduce racial wealth disparities? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I want to back up for a minute because I also want to put on my political scientist hat, because substantive policy proposals of any kind, including reparations, are always linked to the political rules of democracy. And so you can't fight for reparations or anything, like we're in the midst of some fights now around COVID relief. You got to change the rules of the game. It's not as sexy, but you have to go there. So let's back up for a second and say, why was it the case that for the majority of our history, 80% of Americans have been excluded from the franchise? Why exclusion? Because if voting didn't matter, then why would that be such a 100-year campaign by conservatives and the right to prevent people from participating? It's because political institutions have been designed, partly out of slavery in this country, to block vote change. So we're used to incremental change, and then we get into the mindset that we need a strategy for incremental change instead of transformational policy change, where we'd have to take the rules of political institutions seriously. It's why we've seen movement, frankly, on reparations demands at the local level, because they can move faster, there's less blockages. So what would changing the rules of the game look like? What would be the deep democratic reforms that are necessary? So as you said, I'm in DC. One would be DC statehood for Puerto Rico. That changes the dynamic in the Senate, which includes this thing called the filibuster. We need broad voting reforms. This is controversial. I'm fully in favor of what's called universal voting, basically mandatory voting. If you have to pay your taxes, you should have to vote. That would totally change the political dynamics. We have to end voter suppression first, and then we can get to universal voting. We have to end gerrymandering. By the way, fill out your census form, people, because it's the census data that'll be used to set political districts and the boundaries of representation in every single state in this country for the next decade. So gerrymandering is important. We got to get money out of politics. We have to end the electoral college, which Sandy talks about in his book. We have to change the electoral rules around single member districts. How about proportional representation or something else? So I would end by saying a reparations program needs to go hand in hand with changing the rules of the democracy. We need both an inside strategy and an outside strategy. And that is also the role of movements, to help put the rules of our democracy on the table. And let's, by the way, honor the life and legacy of the Honorable John Lewis in this moment, who spent his entire career, he was very clear, from his days as a student activist in SNCC to his days as a member of Congress, why you need movement energy and why you need an inside game. It's not mutually exclusive. They both have to go hand in hand.
Right. Great, thank you. So what I hear you saying, Dorian, is that the rules change, democracy rules change, other kinds of racial rules change, which is what we wrote about in the book. We wrote about lots of different areas where rules need to change. That goes hand in hand with like radical, I'll call them radical, it's fine. Very bold, very big rules changes can then go along with and or enable very big wealth changes like reparations. That's what I hear you saying. Okay, I've got two other questions. I've got a bunch of questions coming in, but I'm gonna try to group two of them. They're both about, you know, like what reparations is for very broadly. So the first is, how do we think about the racial wealth gap, racial wealth need, or our need for reparations in the context of the climate crisis and the health crisis? And the second, which I think is a very pointed and difficult question, but one we have to take on, can we, should we, do we need to position reparations as good for all? So Sandy, I'm going to go to you first on that one, and then Dorian.
So let me take your second question, and I think I'll let Dorian handle the first one. I'm not sure that we can position reparations as being beneficial for all beyond meeting the moral imperative that this nation never has met. I mean, I see reparations as providing the material conditions for full citizenship for Black Americans, full citizenship that has been long denied. On the other hand, I will say that we could design a reparations project, we could finance it in such a way that we would not necessarily harm anyone in the process of doing it. And this is because I embrace the tenets of modern monetary theory, which says that you do not have to increase taxes to increase government expenditure at the federal level. And that the only barrier to additional federal spending is the inflation risk. And that's something that we have to be cognizant of when we add any additional new federal expenditures for any purpose. And in the final chapter of From Here to Equality, we attempt to make it clear that you could design a reparations project in such a way that the payments to eligible recipients could be spaced and provided in such a way that you minimize the inflation risk. One other thing I'd like to add is that in the context of the question of eligibility, in our book, we indicate that the eligibility standards should be twofold for individuals to receive reparations. First, we talk about a lineage standard. So any individual who would have an eligibility claim would have to show that they had at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. The second is what we refer to as an identity standard, which is any individual who wants to make a claim must show that for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations project, or 12 years before the enactment of a study commission, they would have had to have self-identified on an official document. It could be their response to the census question on race as Black, African American, or Negro. And I think these two standards are standards that are quite consistent with the perspective that's been advanced by American descendants of slavery, a movement that has made a strong commitment to the view that it is the descendants of chattel slavery in the United States who have the direct claim on the United States government.
Great, thank you. Dorian, did you want to take on this
I'll
question?
try.
Either good for all or
I'll try
climate?
the first one. I'll try the first one. And just thinking about, I'll be brief here, just thinking about climate change, the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Health. Yeah, health.
Right, so we've been through catastrophic events before, which simply lift the veil and expose existing inequalities, and particularly racial inequalities. And it comes back to wealth, and it comes back to the second question of how does this all benefit us? So think Hurricane Katrina. If you remember, actually, around Hurricane Katrina, it's not that the hurricane actually hit New Orleans proper. It was that the next day, Because if you go back and look at the footage from that, all the cable news channels were saying, oh, thank God, like we didn't get hit so hard. The second day was when the levees broke. The second day was when the levees broke. And right, and that was a question of public investment in infrastructure. That then, when the levees broke, that's when the disaster unfolded even more. And you might think of the moment we're living through is the levees breaking in terms of our inability to deal with this current health crisis of COVID-19.
So just to be clear, you're saying it's not COVID per se, it's our public inability, our institutional inability to deal with the crisis.
Absolutely. So it's the public ability to deal with crises that expose underlying inequalities that were there pre-crisis. And events put these things in sharp relief. And of course, these events, I also think back to my hometown of Chicago. There was a famous heat wave in 1995 that affected poor, elderly Black folks in the poorest parts of the city disproportionately. So, and the city didn't respond. It didn't have the public investment to respond adequately. So I'm saying that there's sort of this broader, the levees have broken because of lack of public investment that connects us all. And this gets to wealth. Some people have the wealth and resilience to weather storms or a virus. And that depends on race, as we know, and it depends on your zip code. So how do we think about building wealth to create very resilient, particularly Black communities, poor Black communities? And by the way, when you do that, when you're able to build resilient communities and healthy communities, that does benefit us all in the midst of a virus that's easily spreadable. So these things are actually connected, but I do think it goes back to, it's a big P political question as well.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Sandy, I've got two questions that have come in. Again, I'm going to try to group them in and hand them to you. And then I think I'm going to let both of you kind of make a final statement, including Dorian. I think you might have some final thoughts on the movement moment we are in. But the two questions I have actually for you, Sandy, actually have to do with different kinds of historical examples for other ethnic and racial groups that have been mistreated, unjustly treated by the US federal government. One question is, why not use the model that was used for reparations for Japanese internment, which you started to reference, Sandy, but you should talk about that more. And then secondly, there's a question, what can we learn from the treatment of Native Americans and indigenous communities by the federal government that would apply to actually getting reparations for Black folks in the US?
So let me take the first. I actually view the provision of reparations for Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II as a model for a reparations project for Black American descendants of US slavery. Precisely what was done there, the provision of direct payments to the victimized community, is in exact parallel with what I think should happen with respect to reparations for Black Americans. And then secondly, I think that there are other instances that provide precedents for the same type of mechanism. One is the payments that were made to families who lost loved ones during the course of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And those payments were made by the United States federal government, even though the US government was not the culpable party in that particular instance. And similarly, the US government provided some set of funds for the families who lost their children in the Sandy Hook massacres. So these are appropriate parallels from my standpoint. The other thing that is a parallel to be drawn from the Japanese American example is the inclusion of a curriculum and instruction component of the reparations project for the purposes of addressing the national memory of the relevant events that led to the case for reparations. So in the Japanese American context, initially, there were provisions in the legislation for a variety of educational programs that surrounded the events of World War II with the internment. And unfortunately, those were underfunded and defunded. But I think that that should be a significant component of a reparations program for Black American descendants of US slavery. With respect to the Native American case, I think that there's not as strong a parallel because the objectives for reparations for Native Americans, I think, are different from the objectives of reparations for Black Americans. So Black American descendants of US slavery have been seeking for 155 years full citizenship in the United States. On the other hand, the Native American case for reparations is associated with a claim for sovereignty.
Right, different. All right, thank you so much, Sandy. Dorian, it's a movement. I'll note that it was the Japanese American movement that actually helped get those reparations over the line. I remember it well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a movement moment. Why don't you close us out by talking a little bit about, what that means, the movement moment.
Yeah, in the American political system, what we know is ideas and policies are simply power relations frozen in a moment in time. And so the fundamental question is, how do you change the power equation? Organizing, protest, mobilization, voting, and then repeat. Let me do that again. Organizing, protesting, mobilizing, voting, repeat. So we have to change the political will to make this conversation a reality, to make it policy. And so it is, as the Movement for Black Lives says, this is a movement moment and it's an all hands on deck moment. So you can go to M4BL, but you can also join a local community organization, join something, do something. Beyond voting, you got to make sure you vote, but beyond voting, but this is all hands on deck. It's going to take millions of people to make this a reality and to change the power dynamics in this country and in this world. So with that, thanks very much to Sandy and thanks to you, Felicia, and the Roosevelt team.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. Sandy and Kirsten, thank you for writing and provoking and pushing us to think bigger. Thanks to Dorian for being such an amazing movement leader. And thanks to all of my colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute for helping us put on this webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining. It's really terrific to dream and fight together. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody.